Greetings everyone, I am preparing to paint a small warband of Ratmen from the Age of Fantasy starter set of one-page rules. You can download the STL print files and rules for this starter set from onepagerules.com. My plan is to paint the fur of each Ratmen model some shade of brown like I did with this rabbit figure. For starters, I spray painted all the models black with a rattle can primer, and then I went back with a white primer and lightly sprayed a zenithal effect to add some shadows. I will cover each model in brown and then go back and add in some highlights with white to show some detail and make it look more like fur. So I have 4 different quick shade washes from Army Painter. From the looks of the label, I have them sorted and arranged from light brown to dark brown. These all came in a quick shade pack, so I haven't used all of them yet, so this will be a fun experiment so I can see just what each shade looks like. I'm going to paint each model in this paint pattern and then repeat the same pattern for the next group of models. I feel like I used this light tone on a rabbit, but honestly I cannot remember. So this will be a cool way of having each rat with its own brown fur and also show a little bit of diversity. First, we will use the light tone. I like to use a cheap synthetic brush when applying base coats of quick shade washes. You need to load the brush up fairly well and have enough paint just to run into the crevices and such for the effect to work properly. The general idea for good brush maintenance is not to load the brush up so much that the paint will dry up into the wick of the bristles. But with effects washes and speed paints, that's a little hard to do, so I just like to use cheaper brushes. And then I go back with my nice brushes just to do small detail work. On the bright side, when you're overloading these cheap synthetic brushes, you can still use them quite a bit before they really start using their point and their nice edge. When that happens, I just downgrade those brushes just to do a terrain paint, in which you might have to do like a stabbing or a cramming motion for the brushes just to get into the cracks and crevices of the detail and the random shapes of terrain. Or if you need to mix 2 different types of paint together, I like to use an old brush for that. Our second wash will be called Mid Brown. I'm not sure how this will look on the video, but to my eyes this tone has a little bit of red to it. It's still brown, but it's more like a dark burgundy. The wash is also darker than I was expecting. Don't be afraid to add more coats when using a wash. Sometimes the effect can be very runny and they spread out very thin. Next, we will do Flesh Wash. I'm assuming by the title that this will be good to use for skin tone, but here at Square Table Union, we don't always use things as intended. I'm pretty sure that this is the first time I've ever opened this bottle. This is a very interesting color. The shade seems to be a little bit in between the last 2 washes. So this is pretty dark for skin tone. So if you're painting a historic army, this kind of reminds me more of like my Dark Italian Wife, or maybe a Mayan soldiers, Middle Eastern, or even darker. I applied mine fairly light because I wanted to get some of this white to shine through, but I bet you can keep applying wash to even go darker. And last we have Soft Tone. Now that I'm applying this color, I'm pretty sure that this is the wash that I used on a rabbit. To me, it has a nice golden retriever look. All of these washes seem to puddle up differently compared to each other. I'm not sure if it has something to do with the primer that I'm using, but some washes are just more runny than others. Be sure to move that brush around and get things to puddle up in the areas that you want to as much as possible. So here are all of the tones lined up. This one on the end is my favorite tone, but for the rest of the video I will focus painting on this one guy on the other end, just because it's my favorite model. This mid brown ended up darker than I was expecting, and the flesh washes are sort of in between the mid brown and the soft tone. These 2 I would classify as being more similar to like a light brown. Now I'm going to switch to just one model and focus painting on it. I'm going to start painting a blue cape with blue tone shades. The effects shades packs come with a lot of primary colors, and I like to hit as many colors as possible using the effect shades, and then go back and add in more color with speed paints in with the shadows and low areas. This is a little backwards from how you would traditionally use shade paints and tones, but this is a little trick of mine, and you'll see later how it works for me. The nice thing about starting with tone washes is that they retain the highlights very well, so you don't have to go back and add the highlights back in using a white paint or something. Now I will switch to Beowulf Blue Speed Paint. I also like to use a 50-50 mix of Speed Paint and Speed Paint Medium, just so I could add a color back in layers if needed. From here on out, I will try to dodge the white highlighted areas and build up the color only in the shadows and the folds of the cape. So now, because of the Zenithal primer effect, the blue tone and the blue speed paint mix, we have a dark blue shadows with a very light blue highlights. Going back to the strong tone, I will paint anything that needs to be brown, like the handle of the weapon, the belts, and the pouches. This will seem like the same color as a fur at first, but then we will add in a brown speed paint later, just like we did with the blue cape. I'm going to keep the armor and the tip of the halberd simple for now, just by using the broadsword silver speed paint. This is one of my favorite paints. I don't really have anything pink to do the rat's tail with, so I'm just going to use a red tone wash, and hopefully it will dry a light red. For most of my bases, I like to base coat them in grim black speed paint, and just add a little color back in later. I don't particularly like to have my bases to stand out a lot, so this is just my personal preference of mine, and I like to keep the bases a little darker than I do the figures. I also like to use a cheap older brush when I do bases, just so I can do a stabbing motion to get under the feet and such. Now, with all the parts like the weapon handle and the belts that I previously painted with strong tone, I will now go back and darken the shadows with Satchel Brown. This is not super impactful, but I like to go back and add highlights to all the metal using shining silver metallic paint. This is an opaque paint, and I don't usually thin metallic paints, especially when adding highlights. Now for any areas that I like to add more shadows, I like to use a dark tone wash, especially in the eyes and the ears of the rat. This is a cheap white paint that I got from my dollar store. I like to use cheap whites for certain highlight effects because the paint goes on thin, and I like to control how much highlights are going in by using it in layers. For starter sets like this, I like to keep things very simple by adding Satchel Brown speed paint to only the top of the base, just to add a little bit of color back in. Okay, so I hope that you have enjoyed this painting tutorial. This is a super easy and quick way to get some decent looking models on the battlefield. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you on our next adventure.